My name is Claire Benson, and if someone had told me that my own parents could turn my sister's wedding into a battlefield over a lake house, I would have laughed and then cried later in private. But that's exactly what happened. From the moment I walked into the grand ballroom of the Willow Creek Inn, elegantly decorated with blush roses and cascading fairy lights, I felt the tension in the air, like a physical weight pressing down on me. Everyone else was smiling, chatting, sipping champagne, and I forced myself to match their expressions, even as I sensed a storm quietly gathering in the corners of the room. My sister, Alyssa, was glowing in her wedding dress, a vision of calm excitement, oblivious to the undercurrents about to erupt. Yet I knew that this day, her day, would soon be hijacked by the one people called family, those I had spent my whole life loving and fearing in equal measure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other wedding day, though a little rushed. My partner, Michael, and I had driven from our home in Cedar Lake, a 2-hour trip, to arrive early enough to help with final preparations. I had spent months helping Alyssa plan the day, organizing seating charts, coordinating with the florist, and keeping her sane through the chaotic blur of wedding dress fittings and tastings. I loved her fiercely, and in my mind, nothing could spoil the day. Nothing except the people who raised me. My father, Robert Benson, and my mother, Elaine Benson, had always had a way of twisting family gatherings into minefields. Their expectations were sharp, their sense of entitlement legendary, and their ability to despise greed as concern was uncanny. I should have known that the sparkling glasses and soft music could not drown out the kind of tension that simmered like a pot left on the stove, waiting for the lid to blow off. As I walked into the bridal suite to help Alyssa with last-minute touch-ups, my phone buzzed in my purse. It was a message from my mother. "Claire, we need to discuss the lake house. It's time you step up for the family." I froze for a moment, staring at the screen, heart pounding. The lake house? That secluded cabin my partner and I had painstakingly renovated over 3 years? The one place that felt like ours? A sanctuary away from the world? I tried to breathe through the sudden knot of dread. I had known my parents could be demanding, but I had never imagined them trying to ambush me on Alyssa's wedding day. The thought of confrontation made my stomach churn. Yet there was that old ingrained fear of disappointing them, of hearing their disappointed sighs and cold, calculating looks. I shoved the phone back into my purse, telling myself I would deal with it later, though deep down, I knew the later might be sooner than I hoped. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Alyssa walked down the aisle to a soft string quartet, her smile radiant, her hand clutching her father's arm as he led her to the altar. Michael stood beside me, squeezing my hand reassuringly, and I whispered to him how nervous I was about my parents. He shrugged, calm and steady, the kind of partner who always made me feel anchored, even when the world tilted sideways. We watched as vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto trembling fingers, and tears glistened on cheeks all around. The officiant spoke words about love, trust, and family, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe in the idea of a perfect day. But perfection, I had learned, was never meant to last. Dinner started with light chatter and clinking glasses. Guests were enjoying hors d'oeuvres, and laughter drifted through the air, blending with soft music. I was seated near the head table, close enough to notice the barely contained tension radiating from my parents. Elaine, my mother, sat upright, her posture precise, eyes flicking toward me like a hawk assessing prey. Robert, my father, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, pretending casualness, while I knew he was plotting some form of disruption. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, calculating how to corner me, how to test my resolve, how to make everyone else bear witness to the lesson he thought I needed. I tried to focus on Alyssa, on her laughter, on the joy everyone else was enjoying, but there was no escaping the cold intensity radiating from the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Finally, as the main course was cleared, my father's voice cut through the hum of conversation, sharp and deliberate. "Claire," he said, his tone carrying the kind of authority reserved for courtrooms or boardrooms. "A word, if you don't mind." All eyes turned toward me, and my stomach sank. I stood, my hands pressed lightly against my thighs to steady myself, and followed him toward the edge of the room, away from the crowd. My mother trailed behind, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to disaster. I could hear whispers from the tables, curious guests sensing the shift in energy, sensing that this was more than a casual request. And then my father spoke again, a little louder, almost theatrical in its delivery. "It's time you handed over the lake house. The family needs it. Alyssa's wedding expenses. Everything we've done. It's all for the family. You can do the right thing, Claire." I felt my chest tighten, a rush of disbelief and anger surging through me. The lake house was ours in every sense except the name on the deed, and yet they were trying to claim it like some family entitlement. I could see the shock flicker across their faces, my refusal already imprinted in my expression before I even spoke. "No," I said firmly, my voice shaking slightly but resolute. "It's not happening. That house is mine and Michael's. We've worked for it. It's ours." The words hung in the air, and suddenly the elegant calm of the wedding felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. And then before I could even brace myself, the moment escalated in a way I had dreaded. My father, red-faced and incredulous, grabbed his wine glass and in a flash of anger and entitlement, hurled it across the space between us, sending deep red liquid splattering against my blouse. My shock and the stunned silence of everyone nearby forming a cage of disbelief around me. The wine stains spread across my blouse like a crimson warning, warm and sticky, dripping onto my hands as I instinctively pressed my palms against my chest. The guests froze mid-bite, glasses paused halfway to mouths, eyes darting between me and my father as if expecting some further spectacle. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a half gasp of horror, but her eyes glinted with that familiar, calculating edge I had known my entire life. Approval, almost, for the chaos that Robert had just created. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, though there was plenty, but from the surge of adrenaline that came with the sheer audacity of being attacked in front of everyone in the name of family entitlement. Michael immediately stepped toward me, gently guiding me back from the edge of the room, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm swirling around my parents. "Claire, let's step outside," he whispered, his voice steady but low enough that only I could hear. I nodded, feeling the sting of wine on my skin and humiliation gnawing at the edges of my composure. But I knew he was right. I couldn't react here, not yet. Once outside, the cool evening air hit me like a balm and a shock simultaneously. My blouse clung uncomfortably to my skin, and I shivered, both from the cold and from the lingering tremor of anger. Michael handed me a napkin from his pocket, but it barely made a dent in the mess. I felt the knot in my chest tighten again as I thought of the dozens of eyes that had witnessed my father's outburst, the whispers that would inevitably start circulating the room once we returned. "Are you okay?" Michael asked gently, his hand brushing my shoulder. I wanted to tell him that I was fine, that I could handle this. But the truth was that I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood, when my parents' disapproval and manipulation had always loomed over me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I'll be okay," I finally said, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the fiery rage and humiliation twisting in my stomach. Michael didn't push further. He simply held my hand, anchoring me as we took a few steps away from the doors of the ballroom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Even as I tried to compose myself, my mind was racing, running through every possible way this could escalate. My parents had always used guilt and family loyalty as weapons, and now, with an audience, Robert had shifted into full-blown aggression. Elaine, though more composed, was a strategist. She never acted without careful consideration. Together, they had orchestrated countless emotional manipulations over the years, but I had always believed that my own boundaries were untouchable in matters of property and personal space. I had thought, perhaps naively, that Michael and I had built a life outside of their reach, that our sanctuary by Cedar Lake was untouchable. But clearly, the lake house represented more than a physical asset. It was a symbol of independence, and in their eyes, anything that symbolized my autonomy was fair game for conquest.
I knew I had to act carefully. A confrontation now, in the presence of wedding guests, could spiral into chaos beyond repair. Yet retreating or staying silent felt equally dangerous. If I didn't assert myself now, my parents would perceive weakness and escalate further. I imagined their conversation behind the ballroom doors, plotting their next move, and it made my stomach churn. I wanted to scream, to tell them to leave, to demand that they apologize in front of everyone for their behavior, but something inside me held back. It was the old instinct, the one I had fought against for years, that told me to protect appearances, to maintain some semblance of civility. But this time, appearances weren't enough. The wine, the anger, the public display, it all demanded a response that went beyond politeness. I realized that my parents had crossed a line that could not be ignored, and I would need a strategy, a way to protect the lake house without causing a complete family meltdown during what should have been a day of celebration. After a few minutes of trying to calm my racing heart, I spotted a quiet bench near the edge of the patio, partially hidden by tall potted plants. Michael and I settled there, and I let myself lean against him, feeling the tension ebb just slightly. "We need a plan," I murmured, still processing the audacity of what had just occurred. Michael nodded thoughtfully. "First, we stabilize the situation. We can't let them dominate the narrative tonight. We address them privately, firmly, and make it clear that you're not giving up the lake house." His calm logic helped steady me, though fear still lingered in the pit of my stomach. I thought about my parents, their smugness, their expectation that I would bow to their demands. For a moment, a memory flashed. Childhood summers at the lake house with my siblings, carefree afternoons on the dock, laughter echoing across the water. That house was my refuge, my proof that I could create a life for myself separate from the influence of my parents. I clenched my fists, determination replacing some of the initial shock. They could throw wine, they could scream, they could threaten, but they could not take what Michael and I had built together. The sound of a distant laugh drew my attention back to the wedding. Guests were slowly resuming their conversations inside, though I knew the whispers had begun, tiny ripples of gossip that would grow if unchecked. I could see my mother, Elaine, peering out the window, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp, assessing me. Robert had retreated for now, likely muttering under his breath, but I knew this wasn't over. Tonight, I realized, would mark a turning point. I couldn't pretend to ignore their tactics, and I couldn't let Alyssa's happiness be overshadowed by the growing tension. I promised myself, as the cool evening air settled around us, that I would navigate this carefully, protect the lake house, defend my autonomy, and somehow salvage the wedding for my sister. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Nothing would be the same after this. My parents' demands had crossed a line, and whether I liked it or not, the battle for the lake house had begun in earnest, right in the middle of a day meant for love, joy, and celebration. Tonight, I would learn just how far they were willing to go, and just how far I was willing to stand my ground. Returning to the ballroom was like stepping back into a delicate powder keg, the air thick with tension and whispers that carried like wildfire across the room. Guests were trying to regain their composure, but the memory of my father's outburst lingered, an invisible mark on the evening that no amount of soft music or carefully placed florals could erase. I smoothed my hands over my stained blouse, grimacing at the sticky residue that clung stubbornly, and tried to walk as normally as possible toward the head table where Alyssa and Michael were seated. My mother, Elaine, rose as I approached, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, and gave me the kind of cold, measured smile that was meant to signal civility while asserting control. I met her gaze evenly, refusing to look away, even as my blood continued to boil. I could feel every guest's eyes flicking between us, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What was really happening between the Benson women and the man who had just committed the audacious act of wine assault? I realized then that the night had irrevocably shifted. Nothing would return to normal, and everyone knew it. Alyssa, blissfully unaware of the full depth of the confrontation, reached for my hand as I sat down next to her. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her eyes wide, full of concern that had nothing to do with decorum. I forced a small, reassuring smile, though the frustration and humiliation still simmered beneath the surface. "I'll be fine," I whispered back, hoping the lie would protect her from panic. But even as I spoke, I could see the tension in the room start to ripple outward. Conversation stalled mid-sentence, glasses clinked a little too loudly, and guests exchanged subtle glances trying to decipher the drama playing out in a space meant for celebration. Michael sat beside me, quiet but alert, ready to intervene if my parents escalated further. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was a reminder that I was not alone in this fight.
Dinner continued, though the mood was irrevocably altered. My father returned to his seat, but the brief absence did nothing to ease the atmosphere. He was a master at projection, always able to mask anger with a superficial calm, yet I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a furnace. Elaine leaned into him occasionally, whispering words I couldn't catch, though the gestures were enough to convey plotting, collusion, strategy. It was clear that they had no intention of letting the evening end without a confrontation, and every bite of my food felt like it was being swallowed under a microscope. I could hear snatches of conversation from nearby tables, guests murmuring softly but pointedly, sharing bits of the incident they had witnessed. Some offered sympathetic glances in my direction, while others seemed fascinated, eyes sparkling with the intrigue of scandal. I hated it. Hated that my personal battle had become public entertainment, but I reminded myself that the only person whose opinion mattered right now was my own. I found a brief moment of respite when the caterer brought over a small plate of dessert, a chocolate mousse topped with fresh berries. I focused on it, trying to center myself, to taste something normal in the chaos. But even then, my mind kept returning to the lake house, the place that had become the nucleus of this conflict. The thought of my parents attempting to seize it made my stomach clench, and I realized with a sharp pang that this wasn't just about property, it was about control, about their attempt to dominate my life in a way that extended far beyond finances. Michael squeezed my hand under the table, grounding me as I let out a quiet breath. "We'll handle it," he said quietly, eyes locked with mine. I nodded, appreciating his confidence, yet unable to shake the worry gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Handling it wasn't just a matter of saying no. It would require strategy, resilience, and the willingness to face my parents at their most manipulative, their most vindictive. And right now, the public nature of this confrontation made every step more precarious. As the evening progressed, the wedding ceremony gave way to speeches and toasts, and I realized with dismay that my parents had seized the opportunity to subtly manipulate the narrative. Robert, with practiced charm, stood to toast Alyssa and her new husband, delivering words that were simultaneously warm and subtly accusatory toward me, a hidden jab that only those attuned to family dynamics could perceive. Elaine's toast followed, layered with what sounded like compliments, but carried the weight of expectation, a reminder of family unity that masked the pressure they were exerting on me. Each word felt like a test, a subtle push to see if I would react, flinch, or crumble. I met each toast with measured smiles, careful nods, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a public response. Inside, my heart pounded, the old fear of disappointing my parents mixing with the newfound determination to finally stand my ground. The realization settled in my mind. If I wanted to protect my lake house and assert my independence, I couldn't rely on hope or avoidance. I needed a plan, and I needed allies.
I glanced around the room, noting subtle signs of support and curiosity alike. Some guests, particularly cousins and aunts who had known me since childhood, gave me tentative, encouraging smiles. A few whispered discreetly, leaning toward me to offer reassurance. Even strangers who had witnessed the incident gave quiet, sympathetic nods as they passed by, their acknowledgments small but meaningful. These small gestures reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone, that the social sphere of the wedding could become an unexpected support network if approached carefully. I also noticed Alyssa watching me with concern, her hand occasionally brushing mine, her eyes silently asking if I was still safe. Protecting her joy while defending myself would be tricky, but I knew I had to try. The delicate balance of diplomacy, courage, and discretion was already shaping itself into a plan in my mind, each mental step measured, each potential reaction analyzed. This evening had become more than a wedding. It was the first battlefield in a struggle for my autonomy, and I was learning quickly how to navigate it without losing myself or the celebration my sister deserved. By the time the first dance was announced, I realized that my father and mother were still circling, subtly attempting to isolate me, probing for reactions, testing boundaries. They had made their intentions clear, and their pride, combined with entitlement, would not allow them to back down easily. I braced myself, silently vowing to protect what was mine, aware that the coming hours would demand strength I hadn't fully summoned yet. And in that moment, as I stood beside Alyssa during her first dance with her husband, I understood that the night was no longer only about celebration. It was about courage, about standing firm in the face of manipulation, about choosing to protect my life, my home, and my sense of self, even when the stakes were high and the opposition was my own blood. The war over the lake house had begun, and there was no turning back.
The first real sign that the situation was about to spiral came unexpectedly during the toasts. Uncle Martin, my mother's older brother, had always been sharp-eyed and observant, a man who rarely missed details others tried to hide. As he raised his glass to Alyssa and Jason, he lingered with his gaze just a fraction longer on me, as though assessing more than my composure, reading the subtle tremor in my hands, the faint traces of wine staining my blouse. I caught the edge of concern in his eyes and realized, almost instantly, that he had seen the full scope of what had just occurred. He didn't speak out, not yet, but the shift was unmistakable. His attention, subtle though it was, felt like a ripple moving through the calm surface of the ballroom. I recognized the significance immediately. An outsider, one whose opinion carried weight in the family, had now begun to see the truth behind the mask my parents wore, and with his awareness came the potential for validation, for support that I had not anticipated. At the same time, it meant the tension could escalate quickly as my parents would notice the shift and attempt to regain control before their plan unraveled in front of witnesses. As the evening progressed, Robert and Elaine oscillated between subtle pressure and overt theatrics. My father lingered near the buffet, offering calculated compliments that dripped with insincerity, his eyes flicking toward me whenever he thought no one else was looking. Elaine floated around the head table, delivering quiet observations to cousins and aunts, each comment designed to test my reactions and gauge the room's perception of the incident. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing between maintaining composure and preparing to defend myself at a moment's notice. The wine incident, though shocking in its immediacy, had only been the beginning. The real challenge was navigating the complex interplay of observation, gossip, and family expectation without allowing my parents to regain dominance. I could feel the weight of each gaze, the subtle tilt of heads, the unspoken questions that hung in the air. Every glance from Robert or Elaine carried the implicit demand: capitulate, apologize, bend. But I refused. Even as my pulse raced and adrenaline flared, I refused. Then came the pivotal moment. During the cutting of the cake, I noticed Uncle Martin subtly leaning closer to Michael and me, his voice quiet, almost conspiratorial. He said, "I saw what happened earlier. Your father, that was unacceptable. You don't have to endure that." Relief surged unexpectedly through me, though it was tempered by the reality of the situation. The room was still full of eyes, whispers, and potential judgment. But Uncle Martin's acknowledgement was a turning point.
It confirmed that someone outside the immediate circle of my parents' influence was beginning to recognize the truth, someone whose opinion carried authority in subtle but important ways. For the first time that evening, I felt a flicker of validation, a sense that I wasn't alone in perceiving the impropriety, and that my stance, my refusal to hand over the lake house, was not unreasonable or immoral. I had thought the battle would be silent, fought only between my parents and I, but now it had entered a broader social sphere, and the implications of that recognition were profound. Robert, of course, noticed immediately. His head snapped toward Uncle Martin, a flash of irritation crossing his features, quickly masked with forced charm. He leaned closer to Elaine, whispering urgently, and I could see the calculation in both their eyes, a strategy to regain control, to manipulate perception, to undermine any support I might receive. But by now, I had anticipated this. I remained seated, poised, and observant, letting the undercurrents swirl around me without giving them the satisfaction of a visible reaction. My mind raced through scenarios. If Robert tried to speak over Uncle Martin, how would I respond? If Elaine attempted to sway the remaining cousins or aunts, what words could I use to assert my position without escalating further? The lake house, once a symbol of personal freedom, had now become the center of a chessboard, and I realized that every move I made, every word I spoke, would carry enormous consequences. Later, during the mingling between courses, a few of the younger cousins approached me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and solidarity. "We saw what happened earlier. That was crazy. Are you okay?" I smiled, grateful for the concern, though careful not to reveal too much. Their acknowledgement, though small, added another layer of reinforcement to my awareness that my parents' actions were no longer isolated. They were visible, undeniable, and beginning to shift the room's perception. Michael, ever steady, offered quiet encouragement, reminding me that the narrative was no longer entirely in my parents' control. Even Elaine, sensing my tension, reached for my hand and whispered, "You don't have to give in. It's your house, Claire. Don't let them take that from you." Her words, filled with love and trust, bolstered my resolve. I realized that the support network, subtle and tentative though it might be, was beginning to take shape, and that the battle over the lake house would not be fought in isolation.
By the time the first dance concluded, the room's energy had shifted perceptibly. Guests were quieter, more observant, and even the catering staff seemed to tread lightly, sensing the delicate web of tension now interwoven into the wedding festivities. I knew the coming hours would test every ounce of composure and courage I possessed. My parents' insistence, fueled by pride and entitlement, was far from over, and with every external observer noticing the truth, their tactics would likely grow more audacious, more desperate. Yet I felt a new, quiet confidence settling within me. The first external witness had seen the truth. The battle lines were forming, and I understood that my refusal to relinquish the lake house was no longer just a matter of personal property. It was a matter of asserting my voice, claiming my autonomy, and standing firm against manipulation that had haunted me my entire life. The night was far from over, and the real struggle was only beginning. But for the first time, I felt the faint spark of empowerment flickering amidst the storm. As the evening wore on, the tension between my parents and me seemed to thrum in the air like a low, persistent hum, almost tangible enough to touch. Every movement, every glance, every carefully measured phrase became a battleground in the silent war over the lake house. I knew that my parents' desire for control wouldn't be sated by one confrontation. This would be a relentless push, a test of my resolve that would stretch far beyond the confines of this wedding day. The realization made me hyper-aware, noting each whisper among the guests, each subtle nudge toward Robert and Elaine from family members who had begun to sense the drama unfolding. I understood, with a mix of fear and determination, that the key to holding my ground lay not in avoiding confrontation, but in collecting evidence, assessing the dynamics at play, and ensuring that my position was undeniable. I had learned over years of observing their manipulations that power, in my family, was asserted both verbally and socially, and that any perceived weakness could be exploited immediately. During a lull between the dinner courses, I quietly excused myself and Michael from the table under the pretext of getting some air. We stepped onto the patio, the night sky stretching above us, dotted with stars that felt distant and impartial.
"We need to think about our next steps," I said, my voice low, mindful that my parents might be watching through the open windows. Michael nodded, his hand brushing mine. "First, we document what's happening. Any witnesses, any indiscretions, any moments that showed their true intentions. We need clarity, and we need backup if this escalates further." I appreciated his calm logic. It was the anchor I needed to counter the emotional storm Robert and Elaine had created. We returned inside, walking carefully, eyes scanning for anyone who could serve as an ally, anyone who could provide subtle support or testify to my parents' aggression if the situation worsened. I realized that the wedding, once meant to be a celebration, had become an arena in which I needed both strategy and poise. By the time the next course was served, I had started mentally cataloging moments from earlier in the evening. The wine being hurled, my mother's pointed whispers to aunts and cousins, Robert's staged smiles and subtle accusations disguised as concern. I began to notice patterns, small details that could not be denied once observed carefully. The way they maneuvered around me, attempting to isolate me from support, the deliberate placement of themselves between me and allies, and the calculated pauses in conversation designed to provoke anxiety or hesitation. I quietly whispered these observations to Michael under the table, forming a mental dossier of evidence. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, his calm presence bolstering my growing resolve. This exercise, though subtle, felt empowering. It was the first time in years that I had consciously begun to recognize my parents' manipulations in real time and to prepare myself for a measured response rather than reacting out of fear. Throughout the dinner course, I noticed other signs of rising opposition from my parents. Robert, ever theatrical, engaged in pointed conversation with the head waiter, subtly implying my supposed misbehavior while casting me in a negative light, testing the staff's sympathy and compliance. Elaine, meanwhile, lingered near the dance floor, subtly encouraging whispers among older cousins, inserting herself into conversations with strategic timing. The duo's coordination was unnerving, yet predictable, and I realized that predictability could be used to my advantage. Every move they made, every maneuver they attempted, was a potential piece of evidence to reinforce my position, and for the first time I actively recognized the importance of careful observation. I wasn't just enduring their aggression, I was documenting it, analyzing it, preparing for the moment when their actions would no longer be able to intimidate me silently.
The first subtle pinch came during the bouquet toss. My mother, Elaine, deliberately positioned herself near the edge of the circle where I stood, ensuring that her presence was noticed, her attention palpable. "Remember, Claire?" she whispered under her breath as she brushed past me, the words almost a threat wrapped in civility. "You know what's expected." I suppressed the reflex to snap back, recognizing that any overt confrontation would feed into their narrative. Instead, I maintained composure, letting the subtle aggression serve as reinforcement for my mental notes. Guests around us began to notice a slight tension, though the seriousness of it was invisible to anyone not attuned to family dynamics. I smiled faintly at a few sympathetic friends nearby, a silent acknowledgement that I was aware of what was unfolding and that I was refusing to bow to intimidation. The act of smiling became a subtle signal of confidence, a declaration that their attempts at manipulation were not succeeding. Later, as the dance floor opened, I noticed Robert attempting to corner me during a waltz with Michael, subtly pressing the issue of the lake house while masquerading it as casual conversation. "We're just thinking about what's best for the family," he said, voice low but intense, eyes piercing. "You know the lake house could serve everyone." I met his gaze firmly, shaking my head. "It's ours. Michael and I worked for it. It's private." His reaction was subtle, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, but it was enough to confirm that the message had been received, though it wouldn't end the push. Elaine hovered nearby, scanning the room as if ensuring that no ally could offer support quietly. I could feel the energy of the opposition intensifying, their strategy clear. Isolate, intimidate, and attempt to create guilt. But my internal shift was also palpable. Where fear once reigned, determination now surged. I realized that the accumulation of these moments, the careful observation, the discreet acknowledgement of witnesses and allies, was gradually turning the tide. I wasn't simply reacting, I was gathering evidence, building moral authority, and fortifying my position for the inevitable confrontation that would come later in the night.
The pivotal moment arrived just as the live band struck up a soft, jazzy tune for the evening dance, a moment that would alter the course of the night and leave no room for doubt about the truth. As I watched the couple swirl across the polished dance floor, I noticed a faint commotion near the bar. One of the younger cousins, Jenna, was quietly signaling toward me, her expression urgent yet discreet. I excused myself from Michael and glided through the crowd, careful not to draw my parents' immediate attention, until I reached her. In a hushed whisper, she handed me her phone, a video already cued and paused. My heart skipped. "It's from earlier," she said, her voice trembling slightly, though not with fear, but with a sense of importance. "I caught everything. Your dad throwing the wine, your mom whispering, everything. It's undeniable." I felt a rush of relief, almost physical in its intensity, mixed with a surge of vindication. The video was unassailable. There could be no rational argument against what had transpired. My parents' aggression, their intimidation tactics, their attempts to manipulate the narrative, they were all captured in real time in a way that could no longer be denied, excused, or spun. The evidence was concrete, visual, and damning, and it was in my hands. I thanked Jenna quietly, my mind racing as I reviewed the video frame by frame. There was my father, red-faced and wild-eyed, swinging the glass with such force that the liquid arced through the air in a deep crimson ribbon. The expressions on the nearby guests' faces, the shocked gasps, the sudden stiffening of posture, and the unspoken disbelief were all preserved in high definition. My mother's subtle gestures, the whispered suggestions to the aunts, the precise timing of her commentary, even her small nods of encouragement to my father before the throw, they were all documented in high definition, impossible to refute. I felt a strange combination of triumph and disbelief. After years of manipulation and covert aggression, the proof I needed had arrived almost serendipitously, at a moment when my parents' actions were already in full display. The moral and factual clarity it provided bolstered my resolve, reinforcing that my stance regarding the lake house was not only justified, but ethically sound. I realized, as I watched the footage, that this evidence could shift the entire balance of power in the room, giving me an unassailable foundation for any confrontation that would follow. Returning to the edge of the dance floor, I held the phone subtly, careful not to let my parents notice. Michael caught my glance and immediately understood. The undeniable proof was in our possession, and with it, the ability to control the narrative rather than be coerced or gaslit into submission. I felt the weight of years of fear, guilt, and intimidation lift slightly. For the first time in a long time, I understood the strength that came not just from words or defiance, but from evidence that could not be misinterpreted, dismissed, or undermined. It was a turning point, the midpoint of the struggle, where the truth became unavoidable, concrete, and capable of altering not only the immediate conflict, but the long-term dynamics with my parents. Their attempts at domination had met an immovable object, irrefutable proof that no amount of charm, logic, or intimidation could erase.
As I observed Robert and Elaine across the room, I noted subtle signs of their awareness. Robert's eyes darted repeatedly toward me, flicking to the phone I had concealed, a hint of suspicion clouding his previously calculated expression. Elaine's posture stiffened, her hands gripping the champagne flute just slightly too tightly. They were beginning to realize, without knowing the full scope yet, that the narrative they had so carefully tried to control was slipping from their grasp. Their attempts at social manipulation, whispered comments, veiled threats, subtle positioning, were rendered far less effective in the presence of clear, objective evidence. The room, still humming with wedding activity, now contained a secret weapon in my possession, and with it came an almost tangible shift in confidence. The awareness that others, too, could witness the truth if necessary provided a protective buffer against further escalation. I no longer felt solely vulnerable. Instead, I felt strategically empowered. Michael leaned closer, his voice quiet but steady. "We have proof. This changes everything. You can handle them now with authority." I nodded, taking a deep breath to steady the sudden rush of adrenaline and excitement. Every fiber of my being was alert, every muscle tensed with the anticipation of confrontation. I knew that the coming moments would test my ability to balance composure with assertiveness, to protect my autonomy while maintaining social decorum, and to leverage the evidence at precisely the right time. The midpoint revelation, the undeniable proof of their aggression and manipulative intent, was the fulcrum on which the rest of the evening would pivot. It provided both validation and power, the kind that cannot be shaken by argument, charm, or intimidation. The knowledge that I now held this in my hands, quietly, while the evening continued around us, was exhilarating, terrifying, and empowering all at once. As I glanced toward my parents again, I felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't simply about the lake house anymore. It was about establishing boundaries, asserting personal dignity, and demonstrating that manipulation and intimidation could no longer dictate the course of my life. Their attempts to control, coerce, and guilt me into submission had been met with incontrovertible evidence, and that evidence would form the foundation of my defense in the moments to come. The wedding, though still unfolding in joyous celebration, had become the backdrop for a confrontation rooted in truth, a truth so undeniable that it could no longer be ignored or twisted. And in that realization, I felt an unmistakable sense of empowerment, one that would carry me forward through the coming challenges, through the inevitable confrontations, and toward the resolution I had long fought to achieve. By the time the music transitioned into a slower, more intimate tune, I knew that waiting any longer would only give my parents more control over the evening's narrative. The undeniable proof on Jenna's phone burned in my pocket, a tangible reminder that the truth was now in my hands and that silence would no longer serve me. For years, I had navigated my parents' manipulations with careful restraint, measured compliance, and a constant weighing of consequences. I had learned how to bend without breaking, how to appease without submitting entirely, and how to maintain the illusion of harmony even while being undermined. But that moment, standing on the periphery of a dance floor as laughter and music swirled around me, marked a turning point. I could no longer protect their image at the expense of my own autonomy, and the thought of finally asserting my boundaries, publicly and decisively, sent a shiver of both fear and exhilaration down my spine. My parents had crossed a line, and I would not retreat another inch. I rose from my seat, feeling the collective gaze of the room subtly shift toward me as I approached the center of the floor. Robert followed closely, his presence a quiet reassurance, a reminder that I was not facing this alone. I could see Robert and Elaine in the corner, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease, the faint tightening of their features betraying the first hints of apprehension. They had no way of knowing yet that I was armed with evidence, that the tide was about to turn. As I reached a central position, I took a deep breath and drew strength from the clarity that had settled in me over the last hours. I was not wrong, I was not weak, and I had the right to stand my ground. The fear that had accompanied me all evening, fear of humiliation, fear of family disapproval, fear of escalation, was still there, yes, but it had been tempered by an equal measure of determination. It was time to stop shielding their image and start asserting my own truth. I began quietly, directing my words to the small circle of relatives and close friends nearest to me, ensuring that they could hear without drawing unnecessary attention. Earlier this evening, something happened that crossed a line, I began, my voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. My father threw wine at me, and my mother attempted to manipulate the room with subtle pressure and intimidation. This isn't a misunderstanding or a minor disagreement. This was deliberate, aggressive behavior meant to coerce me into surrendering my property, my autonomy, and my voice. I watched as a few eyebrows raised, eyes widening in recognition. Even without the video being displayed yet, the words carried weight because they framed the event in a context that could not easily be disputed. The room grew quieter, the hum of music and conversation fading slightly as attention began to focus on me. I felt a strange mixture of liberation and vulnerability. Speaking the truth aloud was terrifying, yet each syllable reinforced my control over the narrative, each word a declaration that I would no longer be silenced. Michael, sensing my need for support, reached for the phone in my pocket and subtly displayed the video to the immediate circle. The reactions were immediate and telling, gasps of disbelief, whispered confirmations, subtle nods of sympathy and validation.
The footage left no room for denial. It captured everything in stark clarity, from the arc of the wine to the deliberate gestures and whispered instructions that had underpinned the aggression. I could see my parents' faces now, Robert's jaw tightening, Elaine's composure cracking ever so slightly, their carefully constructed facades beginning to crumble in real time. I realized that this was exactly what I had been preparing for, my moment of agency, where the truth could no longer be twisted or deflected. I felt a wave of empowerment, a clarity that had been missing for years, as the room collectively registered the reality that had been hidden behind polite smiles and manipulative charm. I continued, voice now stronger, projecting to the wider room. I will not be coerced, threatened, or manipulated into giving up what Michael and I have built. The lake house is ours, and while I love my family, their attempts to seize it by intimidation are unacceptable. I want everyone here to understand what happened tonight, not to create scandal, but so that the truth is clear and accountability is recognized. The murmurs in the room shifted from speculation to recognition. A few of the older cousins stepped closer, offering subtle nods, and I could see Uncle Martin's expression soften with approval. He had been one of the first to notice the truth, and now, watching me take a stand, he seemed silently proud. Even some guests who were less familiar with the family dynamics were now observing with newfound awareness. Understanding that this was more than a private quarrel, it was a declaration of boundaries, autonomy, and integrity. Robert finally spoke, his tone measured but tense, attempting to inject charm and reason. "Claire, you're being dramatic," he said, though the edge in his voice betrayed his lack of control. Elaine, standing slightly behind him, attempted a gentle interjection. "Sweetheart, it's a family matter. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." I shook my head, resolute. No, this needs to be acknowledged here, publicly, so that the behavior and its impact are clear. I am not willing to negotiate my rights under threat and intimidation. My words hung in the air, firm and undeniable. The shift was unmistakable. I had crossed the point of no return, refusing to protect their image and asserting my own voice. I was no longer simply reacting to aggression, I was choosing to confront it, to claim my autonomy, and to stand for what was right. The room's energy had changed, subtly, but irrevocably, as the truth took hold and my parents realized that their control was finally being challenged in a way that could not be undone. The moment the confrontation escalated, the tension in the room became almost suffocating, like a storm pressing down on every guest, forcing awareness of the underlying conflict that had previously been hidden behind wedding decorum and polite smiles. Robert's initial attempt at charm had failed spectacularly, and the carefully constructed mask of civility that both he and Elaine wore began to slip, revealing the full intensity of their anger and frustration. My father's jaw clenched tightly, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of a nearby chair, while my mother's eyes narrowed in sharp calculation, scanning the room for anyone who might offer her covert support or disrupt the momentum I had begun to generate. I could feel the weight of their presence, aggressive and imposing, but fortified by the undeniable proof on Jenna's phone and the subtle nods of solidarity from relatives and friends. I refused to be intimidated. For the first time, the fear that had always accompanied their manipulations was replaced by an acute awareness of my own power. I could speak, I could assert, and I could stand firm without backing down.
Robert's voice grew louder, a mixture of forced reason and underlying threat. "Claire, you're overreacting. This is your family. We're just trying to protect everyone, including you," he said, pacing slightly, his hands gesturing erratically as if the motion could distract from the gravity of the accusations against him. Elaine followed, stepping closer, her tone deceptively gentle but carrying an unmistakable undertone of control. "Darling, let's not escalate this. There's no need to make a scene on your sister's wedding night." Their attempts at intimidation, though more deliberate now, only reinforced my resolve. I realized with clarity that direct confrontation was necessary, that letting them dominate the narrative, even subtly, would only prolong the manipulation and increase the likelihood of surrender. I took a deep breath, raising my voice just enough for the nearest guest to hear, asserting my position with unwavering clarity. This is not about drama. This is about truth and respect. You do not have the right to intimidate me or coerce me into giving up what is mine. The lake house is not negotiable, and your attempts to manipulate or threaten me will not succeed. A ripple of murmurs traveled through the crowd, a mix of shock, admiration, and apprehension. I could see subtle gestures of support emerging, hands lightly placed on shoulders, sympathetic nods, a few whispered words of encouragement. Uncle Martin moved slightly closer, his presence reinforcing the legitimacy of my stance. The room had shifted. The energy that had once been dominated by my parents' control now contained cracks, subtle yet undeniable, through which truth and solidarity were beginning to seep. Robert and Elaine could sense this shift, their calculated aggression increasingly ineffective as guests and family members began to recognize the behavior for what it was: coercive, entitled, and completely unjustifiable. Their frustration became more palpable, and I could see the internal struggle between their instinct to dominate and the social reality that no longer favored them. Robert's next move was almost theatrical in its audacity. He leaned forward, voice low but forceful, trying to isolate me verbally. "You're being selfish. Think of your sister's happiness. Think of the family," he hissed, words meant to shame and manipulate. Elaine, sensing the tension escalating, inserted herself between him and the nearby guests, her presence both a shield and a silent signal that she was prepared to escalate in tandem. But my strategy had already solidified. I did not flinch. I did not retreat. I kept my phone subtly in hand, the undeniable video evidence serving as a psychological anchor that reminded me they could no longer rewrite reality or claim moral authority. I responded calmly but firmly, projecting both control and moral clarity. This is not about drama. This is about truth and respect. You do not have the right to intimidate me or coerce me into giving up what is mine. The lake house is not negotiable, and your attempts to manipulate or threaten me will not succeed. At this, the cracks widened further. Guests now fully recognized that the situation was no longer a minor family disagreement, but a confrontation with clear aggressors and a principled defender. I could see subtle gestures of shock in some of my relatives' expressions, disbelief in others, and cautious admiration among those who recognized the courage it took to stand publicly against such entrenched intimidation. The undeniable proof on my phone amplified the impact. It was not only a personal defense, but also a visible confirmation of what many had suspected but could not articulate. Elaine's composure faltered slightly, her voice rising as she attempted to regain control. "Claire, this is inappropriate. You're embarrassing everyone." Robert mirrored her agitation, his hand gesturing wildly as if the motion itself could impose authority. But the gestures fell flat. Their theatrics were no longer enough to override the weight of truth. I had anticipated this escalation and remained composed, letting their attempts to dominate serve as additional evidence of their aggressive and manipulative behavior. Even Michael, normally calm and reserved, stepped slightly forward, offering quiet support with a firm, reassuring hand on my back. The subtle show of solidarity reinforced the perception that I was not alone, that there were allies ready to uphold truth and fairness. Guests whispered to one another, some moving closer to witness and validate, others silently observing the unfolding confrontation. It was clear that the truth had become public, undeniable, and morally unassailable. My parents' attempt to mask aggression with charm and feigned concern had failed entirely, and their frustration now radiated outward, more dangerous in its intensity but impotent in terms of actual control. The room's energy had shifted,
and with each passing second, their social leverage diminished, while my moral and factual authority strengthened. In that charged atmosphere, I realized the confrontation had reached its peak intensity. The mounting pressure, the visible cracks in their composure, and the undeniable evidence in my possession had created a moment where truth faced deception head-on, exposing the full nature of my parents' entitlement and aggression. The audience was aware, the allies were clear, and the antagonists' masks had fallen. I had entered a new phase of the evening, one in which further escalation would be ineffective, their intimidation powerless, and my authority, grounded in truth and courage, firmly established. The confrontation had not only revealed their true nature to me, but to everyone present, and in that revelation I found both liberation and a renewed sense of purpose. The mountain of manipulation had been exposed, and I stood at the summit, steady and unwavering, ready to continue the battle with clarity, strength, and undeniable truth on my side.
The immediate aftermath of the confrontation left the room in a strange, almost dissonant silence. While some guests quietly murmured in support, others shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to the overt display of familial conflict that had erupted in what was supposed to be a celebratory evening. The weight of judgment, expectation, and tradition pressed down on me, and despite the empowerment I had felt during the confrontation, a profound sense of isolation began to settle in. The recognition that speaking the truth could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment began to hit me fully. I had exposed my parents' aggression and manipulation to everyone present, yet in doing so, I had also shattered the carefully maintained veneer of harmony that the family had cultivated for decades. For a fleeting moment, the fear of backlash, both social and emotional, became almost paralyzing, and I questioned whether my choice to speak up had been worth the chaos that now reverberated through the room. Robert, sensing the tide had shifted against him, withdrew briefly, pacing along the perimeter of the ballroom in tight, purposeful steps that betrayed his simmering anger. Elaine remained at the head table, a composed mask barely hiding the storm behind her eyes. They had been forced to acknowledge publicly what was undeniable, yet that acknowledgement came at a personal and social cost, and now they were navigating the fallout with careful calculation. I could feel their eyes on me intermittently, a mixture of resentment, disbelief, and veiled threat, as if daring me to falter under the mounting pressure. My body tensed with awareness of their scrutiny, the adrenaline that had fueled my courage earlier now mingling with the emotional weight of the moment. Every glance from them felt like a test, a reminder that while the truth had been revealed, the consequences of defying them, socially, emotionally, and within the family hierarchy, were not yet fully realized. As I stepped back toward my seat, my mind began to replay every interaction from the evening, each subtle manipulation, each whispered suggestion, each act of intimidation, now amplified by the reality of confrontation. The evidence in my hands had shifted the power dynamic, but it had also illuminated the depth of opposition I would continue to face. Whispers began to ripple across the room as relatives debated quietly among themselves, some expressing sympathy, others questioning whether I had overstepped the bounds of propriety on my sister's wedding night. Even those who had silently supported me seemed hesitant. The tension of tradition and family expectation created a complex backdrop against which my courage was now measured. I felt a pang of loneliness, realizing that speaking out had created both clarity and separation. I had allies, yes, but I had also drawn lines that could not be easily crossed back, creating a space in which I was simultaneously vindicated and isolated. Michael, sensing my internal struggle, reached for my hand beneath the table, offering quiet reassurance without words. His presence reminded me that even amid the potential backlash, there was steadfast support, and that I was not navigating this alone.
Yet, the emotional toll was undeniable. Every time I caught my parents' eyes lingering on me with disapproval or thinly veiled malice, a flash of anxiety coursed through me. I could feel the social weight pressing down, the subtle judgment of distant relatives, the unspoken commentary of friends, and the cultural expectations that weddings were meant to be harmonious celebrations, not battlegrounds for long-standing familial conflicts. The juxtaposition between moral clarity and emotional vulnerability created a dizzying mixture, and I felt the first true wave of exhaustion and self-doubt of the evening. I had acted boldly, yet the consequences were immediate, visceral, and deeply personal. The emotional intensity continued to escalate during the speeches. As toasts were given, a few well-meaning relatives attempted to inject levity, but their words rang hollow against the backdrop of the night's confrontation. I noticed glances exchanged between my parents and others, subtle attempts to rewrite the evening's narrative through charm or persuasion, but the undeniable video evidence hung over every attempt like a shadow. The tension between public perception and private reality created a surreal atmosphere. Smiles were painted over discomfort, laughter echoed through unease, and I moved through the evening aware that every gesture, every nod, each polite acknowledgement was now weighed against the truth I had exposed. The isolation of being both principled and publicly scrutinized became acute. I felt the psychological pressure intensify, a reminder that courage often comes with a steep personal cost. At one point, Robert approached me, quietly and near the dance floor, his voice low and edged with forced calm. "Claire, this isn't how you handle family," he said, attempting to appeal to guilt and social conformity. "You've embarrassed everyone." His words were meant to destabilize, to provoke hesitation or regret, but they also crystallized for me the reality of speaking truth. There would be resistance, resentment, and a desire to punish honesty. Elaine soon joined, her expression calm but eyes sharp. "Please, consider how this reflects on your sister's wedding night. You can still smooth things over," she urged. I shook my head firmly, recognizing that any compromise at this point would undermine both the evidence I held and the moral stance I had chosen. The choice to speak truth carried consequences, yes, but silence would carry even greater cost to my autonomy and self-respect. The mounting pressure, the social isolation, and the emotional toll created the night's lowest point, a moment in which fear, doubt, and exhaustion threatened to overshadow the empowerment I had felt earlier.
As the hours stretched on, I retreated briefly to the balcony for air, the cool night breeze a small relief against the emotional intensity within the ballroom. Alone for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to reflect on the stakes. The confrontation had been necessary, but the aftermath was heavy. The whispers, the glances, the subtle judgments, and even the sympathetic gestures were all part of a complex emotional calculus. I felt the full weight of the consequences of asserting my autonomy, yet I also recognized that this low point, the isolation, the social tension, the emotional strain, was temporary. Speaking truth often carried backlash, but it also created the conditions for validation, justice, and eventual resolution. In that quiet moment, I resolved to face the remaining challenges with clarity and courage, understanding that the emotional and social toll, though steep, was a necessary passage toward vindication and empowerment. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted into a tense quiet, a charged stillness that seemed to hold everyone's attention on the unfolding conflict, and I knew it was time for the final push. The music had tapered off, leaving only the faint murmur of conversation and the distant clinking of glasses, and I realized that the confrontation needed to move beyond subtle assertion and quiet evidence. It had to become public, undeniable, and unavoidable. With Jenna's phone safely in my hand, the undeniable footage of my father's aggression and my mother's manipulations ready to be displayed, I stepped forward into the center of the room, drawing the gaze of relatives, friends, and even distant acquaintances who had arrived for the wedding, but were now involuntarily spectators to the unfolding drama. Michael moved with me, a silent pillar of support, and together we created a visible front that could no longer be ignored. The time for hesitation had passed. The truth was ready to be confronted in a formal, unflinching way. I raised my voice just enough to project across the room, steady and deliberate. "Everyone, I need your attention for a moment," I began, watching as heads turned, curiosity, apprehension, and surprise reflected in the faces of my family. Earlier this evening, my father threw wine at me, and my mother attempted to manipulate everyone here to force me to give up the lake house. This behavior is unacceptable, and it's important that the truth be recognized, not hidden behind politeness or fear. I paused to let the words sink in, scanning the room and noting the subtle reactions, shifts in posture, widened eyes, and discreet nods of support from those who had suspected this dynamic but had never witnessed it so clearly. The room was now silent, the collective attention fixed on me, and I felt the gravity of the moment settle across my shoulders. This was the climax, the moment when truth and deception faced each other directly, and when the choices of everyone present would either validate or ignore the reality I was asserting. Michael stepped forward, his calm presence reinforcing the authority of the moment, and gently held up the phone for all to see. The video began to play. The video capturing the arc of the wine, my father's red-faced aggression, and my mother's subtle manipulations to control the reactions of around us. Gasps rippled through the room as the undeniable proof played out on the small screen, the sound of liquid hitting the floor, the expressions of shock and fear on my own face, and the incredulous responses of nearby guests all rendered in stark clarity. There was no ambiguity, no room for reinterpretation or misdirection. The evidence made the confrontation formal and undeniable. The truth was now publicly visible, captured and witnessed, and the social leverage my parents had relied on for decades was crumbling with every passing second. The moral authority that had fueled my courage now gained objective force, turning the tide of social perception in my favor. I continued to speak, my voice firm, deliberate, and unwavering. This is not about revenge or creating drama. This is about accountability, respect, and recognizing the behavior that has caused harm. I am standing here to assert my boundaries, to protect what is mine, and to demonstrate that manipulation and intimidation have consequences. The lake house is ours, and my parents' attempts to coerce me tonight are documented and witnessed by everyone here. As I spoke, I noticed a subtle shift in my relatives' expressions. Some, previously hesitant or conflicted, now nodded with recognition, their sympathy and support becoming more overt. Others, previously unsure or intimidated, began to acknowledge the validity of my claims through quiet gestures, crossed arms relaxing, posture straightening, eyes meeting mine with understanding rather than judgment. The room itself seemed to recognize the moral clarity of my statement, and the mounting pressure on my parents intensified visibly. Robert's face twisted with frustration, the last vestiges of his composure evaporating under the weight of public exposure. He attempted to speak, but his words faltered, stammering as he tried to navigate the undeniable reality that was now visible to everyone. Elaine's hands trembled slightly as she held her glass, her attempts at subtle intimidation no longer effective in the face of documented truth.
The combination of objective evidence, public acknowledgement, and moral authority had left them cornered in a way that words or charm no longer remedied. Guests whispered to one another, some offering verbal support, others simply watching in awe as a family secret became visible and accountability began to take shape. The confrontation had moved from private tension to public reckoning, and the shift was palpable. My parents could no longer claim control or reinterpret the events. The truth had reached a moment of undeniable exposure.
I felt a surge of clarity and confidence as I continued to address the room, reinforcing the moral and factual position I had established. "This is about more than just tonight," I said, my voice strong, resonant, and filled with conviction. "It's about establishing boundaries, asserting personal dignity, and ensuring that aggressive manipulation is recognized and cannot continue unchecked. I hope this serves as a reminder that truth, courage, and integrity are more powerful than intimidation and coercion." The room responded subtly but unmistakably. Quiet affirmations, supportive gestures, and nods of acknowledgement created an environment in which my parents' power over perception had been neutralized. For the first time that evening, I felt the full weight of victory, measured, controlled, and morally grounded, backed by undeniable evidence and supported by witnesses who had now seen the truth unfold. By the end of the night, the confrontation had reached its apex, the culmination of hours of tension, observation, and strategic action. The truth had been presented formally, publicly, and with clarity. The evidence was objective, undeniable, and unassailable, and the moral authority rested firmly on my side. My parents, forced to face their behavior in front of family and friends, were cornered, exposed, and unable to manipulate or intimidate further. The final push had succeeded. Truth had been validated, deception confronted, and boundaries asserted. As I stood there, heart steady and mind clear, I realized that this moment marked not only the climax of the evening, but the turning point in a long struggle for autonomy, respect, and justice, one that would shape both my relationships and my personal empowerment going forward. The moments after the public confrontation were charged with a strange mix of relief, tension, and the first real sense of justice beginning to take shape. The undeniable evidence of my father's aggression and my mother's manipulations had left no room for ambiguity, and the reactions from the room made it clear that the moral weight of the evening now rested firmly on my side. Conversations shifted subtly, whispers of support and validation spreading like ripples across the gathered family and friends. Some relatives, who had previously been silent observers, approached me with quiet congratulations or gentle touches on my arm, signaling solidarity and recognition. Even those who had seemed hesitant during the confrontation now appeared to understand the stakes, acknowledging that what I had done, standing up publicly, backed by incontrovertible proof, was both courageous and necessary. The tension that had filled the room began to ease, replaced by a careful but unmistakable acknowledgement that the truth had prevailed. Robert and Elaine, meanwhile, were visibly recalibrating, their previous displays of aggression replaced by defensive postures, furtive glances, and increasingly muted interactions. They had lost the social leverage they had relied upon for so long. Their attempts at intimidation and charm had failed in the presence of objective truth and witness validation. My parents were beginning to understand that their previous patterns of manipulation and coercion could no longer operate unchecked, that the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I noticed Robert's lips pressing into a thin line as he avoided eye contact with others, his once dominant presence now diminished. Elaine's hands fidgeted with her champagne flute, a slight tremor betraying the emotional strain that the evening's revelations had imposed on them. They were forced into an uncomfortable awareness. Their actions were seen, judged, and no longer protected by silence or unspoken family loyalty.
For the first time, the consequences of their behavior were not theoretical, but immediate and visible, and it was profoundly validating to witness the shift. Michael stayed close, his calm and supportive presence a steadying influence as I processed the emotional weight of the evening. Together, we quietly began to survey the room, observing how the truth had begun to alter relationships, perceptions, now approached to offer acknowledgement of the situation, subtle gestures of support, or simply the affirmation that they had witnessed the events and recognized my integrity. Uncle Martin, who had remained a steadfast ally, stepped forward and quietly commended me for standing firm. His words carried both personal and social weight. "You did what was right, Claire. It wasn't easy, and it won't be forgotten. You've set the record straight, and your courage matters." Hearing those words, I felt a tangible lift in my confidence, a validation of the months and years of restraint, strategy, and internal struggle that had led to this moment. It was a powerful reminder that speaking truth, even amid fear and resistance, could create meaningful change and recognition.
The social consequences for my parents were equally tangible. Relatives who had once deferred to their authority now treated them with cautious respect at best, their usual influence diminished by the visibility of their actions. Even some of their friends, who had previously provided implicit reinforcement of their behavior, were now forced to acknowledge the reality that their conduct had been aggressive and unacceptable. The wedding, once a venue for performance, charm, and social expectation, had become a stage for accountability, and my parents were learning that their attempts to dominate the evening would no longer succeed. They retreated quietly to a corner, engaging in hushed discussions that were no longer able to sway the opinions of the room at large. The power they had wielded for so long had been systematically neutralized by truth, visibility, and moral clarity, and the shift was undeniable. It was not merely personal vindication, it was a social recalibration, an acknowledgement that aggression and manipulation could be met with both moral and tangible consequences. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere became less tense, though not entirely celebratory. Guests would turn to the dance floor and tables, offering congratulations, smiles, and subtle gestures of acknowledgement, while my parents maintained their subdued presence, now acutely aware of the social and moral cost of their actions. I felt a deep sense of relief, not only because I had successfully defended my autonomy and property, but also because the confrontation had created an environment in which honesty, integrity, and boundaries were now clearly recognized. Michael squeezed my hand, a small but powerful reminder that I had not faced this alone, and that the solidarity of those who valued truth and fairness had fortified me throughout the ordeal. The lake house, which had been the initial source of conflict, was now safe, its ownership no longer in question, and my parents had no avenue left to coerce, manipulate, or intimidate me further. The victory was both personal and social, a combination of moral authority, strategic action, and public validation that could not be reversed. By the time the evening reached its conclusion, a sense of resolution had begun to settle over the room. While the wedding itself continued, complete with laughter, dancing, and celebration, there was a subtle acknowledgement among the guests that the evening had been more than a ceremony. It had been a demonstration of courage, integrity, and accountability. My parents, forced to reckon with their own actions and the resulting social consequences, were left to reflect on the fallout privately, while I experienced a profound sense of vindication and empowerment. The confrontation had reached its natural resolution. Truth had prevailed, the aggressive behavior had been recognized and documented, and my autonomy, dignity, and moral authority had been restored. In that moment, I understood that justice did not always come in the form of punishment alone. Sometimes it came as recognition, as validation, and as the irreversible establishment of boundaries that could no longer be violated.
The night had finally begun to wind down, the last guests exchanging polite goodbyes and congratulatory hugs as the music softened to a gentle hum, signaling the conclusion of a wedding that had been both joyous and tumultuous. I found a quiet corner near the balcony where the soft glow of string lights reflected off the lake outside, creating a serene backdrop that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the evening's earlier confrontations. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe fully, feeling the weight of adrenaline and tension slowly dissipate. The confrontation with my parents, the public exposure of their behavior, and the defense of my autonomy had left a lingering echo of both empowerment and relief. I realized that despite the chaos and emotional toll, I had achieved something profoundly transformative. I had asserted my boundaries, defended my property, and reclaimed my moral authority. And the recognition of that truth had rippled through my family and social circle in ways that would resonate long after the evening ended. Michael approached, his quiet, reassuring presence a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil that had dominated the night. He slipped an arm around my shoulders, drawing me into a gentle embrace, and together we looked out over the lake, the water reflecting the moonlight in calm, undisturbed ripples. It was a visual reminder of the equilibrium that had been restored, not just in my external circumstances, but within myself. I felt the enormity of what had happened crystallize. Standing firm against aggression and manipulation had not only protected the lake house and my property rights, but it had also affirmed my capacity for courage, clarity, and moral resolve. The empowerment I had experienced earlier in confrontation had deepened now into a more enduring sense of self-assuredness, the kind that comes from knowing that one's actions are aligned with truth, integrity, and personal values. The victory was no longer fleeting adrenaline. It was a solid, unshakable foundation upon which I could build confidence, independence, and a renewed sense of purpose.
As the night drew to its close, relatives and close friends offered quiet congratulations, their words sincere and tinged with admiration. Some of them, who had once hesitated to speak out or intervene, now expressed relief and respect for my willingness to confront a long-standing pattern of manipulation and entitlement. Even those who had been wary or conflicted during the confrontation now seemed to acknowledge that my actions had been both necessary and courageous. The social dynamics within the family had shifted irreversibly. My parents' previous attempts to dominate or intimidate had been exposed and neutralized, and the consequences of their behavior were clear to all present. In the soft glow of the remaining lights, I could see subtle changes in expressions and posture, signs of a recalibrated respect for personal boundaries and accountability. The evening had become more than a celebration. It had been a demonstration of integrity, courage, and the power of standing firm in the face of intimidation. Later, alone for a moment on the balcony, I reflected on how much the experience had transformed my perspective. The confrontation had been painful, stressful, and emotionally draining. Yet, it had also revealed an inner strength I had long relied on, but had never fully acknowledged. The ability to assert boundaries, defend one's rights, and confront wrongdoing, even when the stakes are high and the opposition is formidable, was a skill and a power that extended far beyond the events of a single night. I realized that empowerment was not merely the absence of fear, but the conscious choice to act with clarity and courage despite it. The validation I had received from allies, witnesses, and even subtle social acknowledgement reinforced that the act of standing up for oneself can create a ripple effect, inspiring respect, accountability, and long-term change in relationships, dynamics, and perception. As I re-entered the ballroom one last time, I observed my parents seated quietly, subdued, and noticeably aware of the new boundaries that had been established. Their aggression and manipulation had been curtailed, not through compromise or negotiation, but through the unwavering application of truth, evidence, and moral clarity. The lake house was secure, my autonomy affirmed, and the broader social dynamics had shifted to reflect the consequences of their actions. Witnessing the subtle recalibration in their demeanor, I understood that the real transformation of the evening extended beyond the immediate confrontation. It was a broader lesson in courage, accountability, and the enduring power of integrity. I had learned that the act of standing firm, even when lonely or challenging, could generate profound change, both within oneself and in the world around. The final hours of the wedding passed with a gentle return to celebration, laughter, and the quieter rhythms of connection. Guests danced softly, shared stories, and exchanged warm farewells, the tension of earlier confrontations giving way to an atmosphere that balanced acknowledgement of the night's events with the ongoing joy of the occasion. I remained conscious of the transformation that had occurred, not just in my parents, not just in the family dynamic, but within myself. I had confronted fear, stood firm against manipulation, and emerged with a sense of empowerment, self-respect, and moral clarity that could not be undone. The lake house, a tangible symbol of independence and accomplishment, now represented more than property. It embodied my resilience, my courage, and the enduring power of truth. By the time I finally left the ballroom, stepping into the cool night air and feeling the reflection of the moonlight shimmer on the lake, I recognized that the story of the evening was not simply about confrontation or conflict. It was about transformation, self-assertion, and the long-term impact of choosing integrity over fear. I had faced the highest stakes of emotional, social, and familial pressure and emerged not only victorious, but fundamentally changed. The experience had forged a stronger sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of courage, and an unwavering belief in the power of truth. I walked away with the knowledge that boundaries, justice, and personal empowerment are not just abstract ideals. They are attainable realities when one chooses to act with clarity, courage, and conviction, and that the lessons of this night would continue to shape my life, my relationships, and my sense of self for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.